Okay, good morning, year 10. Today we're looking at our second lesson, of our Western Front revision refresher course. Today we're looking at medical problems and it's going to be in the exact same format as last time on forms. So I'm just going to go over to the form section. So obviously you would have done the first step if you're watching this video. The next step that you have to do, so for question 1, is look at the images and try to remember and identify the main medical problems. And all you have to do, I've already written down one for you here, is write down, list the medical problems. Now they are 7, you get 7 points based on whether you get them correct, and you just need to write them down. Now obviously there might be some spelling errors, so if it comes up saying that you've got it wrong when actually you can see it's a correct answer, it's just because it was they're very specific as to what answer that we put in. So I don't want to give it all away as to what the medical problems were, but essentially what we're doing in today's session is we're refreshing our memory about the effects that the war had on people. And that can be physical effects, so things that harmed people's in reality. It could have been fatal, so causing death and serious injury. It could have been psychological. It might be medical problems that were, that could be easily fixed. And really, it's linked to what we were thinking about last lesson, because the conditions of the trenches and being in battle would have an impact on people, and these are the medical impacts. And we're calling them the medical problems. Now, I'm also putting up on your screen the knowledge grid for the medical problems, and the reason why I'm doing that is, number one, just so that you can refresh your memory to help you when you are identifying what medical problems there are on the Teams form. And also, really, you want to be able to at least remember a statistic or piece of information about each medical problem. And that's really going to help you when you're describing a feature of a medical problem, or you're in need of some knowledge for your PIPCAL question, and ultimately just to be able to really understand a source. It gives you the context. Now, I would, at this point, if you're doing revision cards on Western Front, maybe pause the video and use the knowledge grid for medical problems to create revision cards. You may want to make sure you have this written down somewhere in some sort of revision material, because it's very likely that those questions will come up in future low stakes quiz question. So you want to be in a position where you know the content. Now, obviously this is a skills paper, so we're going to jump straight into the skills. After you've done your first question, we are looking at the question today, so I'm just going to scroll down here. We are looking at how useful are sources A and C for an inquiry into the dangers of artillery fire on the Western Front. So we're thinking about how useful are the sources into a question. So if you're an investigator investigating about the dangers of artillery fire, are those sources useful to you? Now, this is the first thing that we're doing. We are going to read through the sources. So I've actually done source A for you completely. So you are actually only looking at source C. So I'm going to model what I want you to do with source A. So this is source A. And I've already done this, which is why it's completed. But this is really needs to be what your rationale is. So I'll still write over what you need to do. So source A, from the memories of Private Harry Patch of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, describing events in 1917. Now straight away, hopefully you notice that I'm using 2 different colours, one blue, one green. And that's to just stick with the theme of anything in blue, I'm writing about my provenance, and anything in green, I'm writing about the content of the source. So I'm reading the source and thinking about what can I learn from the source and what inferences I can make. So straight away, since we're looking at the provenance, we might be able to think, well, the question's asking us, why is source A useful? How is source A useful for an inquiry into the dangers of artillery fire? So by reading this, I can see, I'm just going to make this smaller, I can see that it's from the memories of Private Harry Patch of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, describing events in 1917. So straight away, I can identify the provenance of the source. The nature, it is someone describing, so it's his memories. The origin, it's Harry Patch, who was part of the light infantry. And he's describing events from 1917. So we know that he's retrospectively speaking about the time of 1917. Now we need to think about that provenance, and we need to understand, why is that useful for us? Why is it the fact that he's a soldier who fought in 1917? Why is that more useful for us in learning about the dangers of artillery fire than a let's say a more useful than an ambulance driver? So we can argue that an ambulance driver in 1914 was useful, but what we want to argue here is, why is he more useful? So when you're thinking about your provenance and you're thinking about explaining why the provenance is useful and how it's useful, really try to make sure that you're explaining every single part of that. So I've already written this down. So over here, I've put down that it's his memories. He's part of a light infantry. You know, he has some credentials. He fought in the war, so it's a first-hand experience as a soldier. He might have experienced artillery fire himself. He would have witnessed it. You could argue maybe it's not that useful to us because it's in retrospect, so it's not as if it's a letter that he's writing right in the moment. He's describing events that happened to him in the past. So you really need to think, how does this provenance make the source useful? Now that's going to come to us it's going to come handy in a second when we're looking at source C. But that's the kind of rationale behind it. You really need to pick apart the provenance and think, why is that useful? It's not good enough just to tell me what it is, the provenance. You need to explain to me why it's useful. Now let's think about the content of the source. What can you learn about the dangers of artillery fire based on this source here? So here it says, the shelling was bad. You could hear the big shells coming, although if you could hear them, that was all right. They'd just gone over. You never heard the whiz bangs coming, they were just there. And you never heard the shell or the bullet that hit you. Of course, whiz bangs were shrapnel, and that was worse than a bullet. A bullet wound was clean, shrapnel would tear you to pieces. It was a whiz bang that killed my 3 friends and wounded me. It was just bad luck. They were hit in veins and arteries, and the blood loss was horrific. It was pouring from them, and there was no way to control it. I had a graze across my leg. Still, it got me some time away from the front, and that was certainly appreciated. So, what we need to know to be able to write our typical paragraph on source A is, we need to think, what is this telling us about the dangers of artillery fire? And the things that I've highlighted are some information, key information that we're learning about the dangers of artillery fire based on this source. For example, we now know that one danger is that you're not always aware of the artillery fire. It's unpredictable. It's a fast-paced environment. We also now know this source is useful to us because we now know about shrapnel. We know that it's deadly. It'll tear you to pieces. It's particularly damaging to organs. We know that there are big repercussions, blood loss, potential long-term impacts with infection. We also know that there's death. So it's, a big impact. And just from this, if I didn't know anything about Western Front, I now know certain examples and certain things about the dangers of artillery fire. And that's what you need to be doing when you first look at your source. So this is source A, and you'll be looking at source C. So the second thing that you need to do, so after looking at the medical problems, secondly, all you need to do is read through the source and make an inference about the dangers of artillery fire. So what can you learn about artillery fire based on that source? You might have learnt about, the impact of it, the physical impact, the psychological impact, a long-term impact, a short-term impact, maybe how bad it was. It gives you an insight into the reality. All of those words might guide you into helping you understand what you're learning. Just imagine you know nothing of artillery fire, which is any form of, you know, equipment used in battle. And what are you learning based on this source? And that's what you'd be writing. And you'd be given 1 point based on a very good inference that you're making. Now, obviously, you can't just make an inference alone. So on the next thing, on the same one, you also need to be able to give a quote. So after you tell me what you've learned from this source, you then need to give a quote. Literally, pick out a couple words, a sentence, something to prove what you're saying. After you've done that, you're going to look at the provenance. So I've already given you the provenance, and all I want you to do is tell me why the provenance makes the source more useful. So in this case, the provenance of this source is it's from the memoirs of Arthur Savage, who joined up in 1916. So we know he's a soldier. It's from his kind of memory sort of collection. Maybe he's writing down all his thoughts. Maybe he's, sending an autobiography. He was part, when you think of his origin, the origin of this, he fought in the war. 1914 to 1918 is the First World War, and he fought. And he tells you a little bit about the dangers of artillery fire. And we would have already identified what we're learning based on what he's saying. But now I want you to tell me, why is it useful, the fact that it's a description from a soldier who fought in 1916? Why does that make it useful to us? After you've done that, I want you to actually write a PIPCAL paragraph for source C. So I've put down source A for you. So I'm just going to read it out to you so that you can get an idea of what I want you to do. So the exact same thing, I'm just going to switch to this section here. So source A, just so you can see the colour, it's point, inference, provenance, knowledge, and link. That's our PIPCAL paragraph. You should be able to notice that the biggest parts of the PIPCAL paragraph are these two here. They're the biggest sections, and that's what you need to make sure that in your PIPCAL paragraph, you're talking about the content of the source, so what you're learning and making sure you're quoting the source, and how the provenance makes it more useful. Now remember, our entire question is how useful is source A and C for an inquiry into the dangers of artillery fire. So in this case, it's how useful is source A. So source A is useful for an inquiry into the dangers of artillery fire, as it gives us an insight into the physical impact of artillery fire and showcases how unpredictable it was. That's something I've learned based on the content of the source. For example, source A states they were hit on veins and arteries and the blood loss was horrific. This suggests that the impact of artillery fire was destructive to the health of soldiers. We can deduce that artillery fire not only caused physical problems, but also led to problematic complications such as blood loss and infection, making artillery fire even more dangerous due to its long-term impact. Notice how I refer to it being dangerous because I'm trying to link back to the question, which is asking me, how is this useful for telling me about the dangers of artillery fire? Now I'm going to move on to provenance. The value of the source, which is our sentence starter, is increased. I'm saying it's increasing because it is an account from Private Harry Patch, who was part of the light infantry. Not enough to get me any marks. Me just telling you who wrote it or where it's from, what it is. This is the part that's important. By being an account from a soldier, the source is valuable for an inquiry into the dangers of artillery fire. This is the important part. Because it was a first-hand experience on the battlefield. Patch would have experienced artillery fire frequently, therefore would have understood and witnessed the damaging effects. While his personal account may have been affected by trauma and thinking retrospectively, it's still useful in telling us an account of what happened when artillery fire was used and the unpredictable effects. Then I go to knowledge. This is not surprising due to the fact that artillery fire was the cause of half of all casualties on the Western Front. The damaging, explosive nature and frequency explains why it was so dangerous for soldiers in the trenches. Consequently, source A is useful for an inquiry into the dangers of artillery fire because it is a primary account which highlights the short-term physical and long-term impact of artillery fire on soldiers. And that is what you need to be doing. So this is a model paragraph on source A. Now what you need to do is use the sentence starters that I have provided you It's on your form as well. So just do the same thing for source C. Literally, just like you did last week, going through the the sentence starters, and there's a typo there, that should be 2 L's, and putting in your answer. Once you finish that, I'm going to give you another question that I want you to do. So another exam practice question. And this would be the last one of the 3 that you do in section A. Last week you did a describe to feature question. You've done Pip-Boy last week and right now a paragraph. And you also have a follow-up question. So it asks you here, how could you follow up source C to find out more about the problems treating soldiers on the Western Front? So I'm going to just again show you on this one over here. This is what it looks like in an exam. It asks you for some detail in a source. It asks you about a question you would like to ask. It asks you what type of source you'd use to find out an answer to your question. And then you have to explain the rationale about how your source is going to answer your question. So you need to make sure that you are answering every single one downwards. Because you can't get a mark for this one, for example, if you haven't answered the ones prior. They are linked. So when it asks you for details in source C, I would follow up. Because source C is a text, all that's asking is a quote that is needed in source C that you would follow up, that is talking about, if we go back to our question, that's asking you about the problems treating soldiers on the Western Front. So if you look at source C and you think you're reading through it, so I was ordered to go in a firing squad in 1917. Most of the poor sods were mainly convicted on the evidence of doctors. They would not accept that men could reach a point of utter exhaustion when, as a result of trench warfare, their nerves and brains would snap. These so-called doctors would not have it that there was such an illness as shell shock. They insisted that men were cowards and deserters. So based on what they've said in source C, are there any bits of details, so a quote that you can pick out to help you follow up? So how could you follow up source C to find out more about the problems? So you're just looking for a quote, and you would put a quote in this box here. You then have to ask a question. Now this question needs to be relevant to what you want to find out. So you're trying to find out, based on that source, any information that you can find out about the problems treating soldiers. So you need to ask a relevant question. Once you've done that, you need to think about what type of source you would use to help answer your question. So imagining you are an investigator. So in this case, I have given you some examples. National records and local records, and you can think of more that may potentially help answer your question. Now it's going to be specific to you. And after you finish that, you need to make sure that lastly, you're explaining how your source is going to answer your question. Now what I would like you to do right now is to fill that in to the best of your ability based on that source. And after you've done that, I'm then going to show you a model answer. But obviously that model answer is going to be different to the one that you're writing. I don't want you to just copy it in, but try to write it. So pause the video and try to write an answer to those questions. Okay, hopefully you've paused the video so I can show you what I mean by that. It's the first time that we're doing it after a while, you know, good for a long time now. So don't feel like you don't feel worried if you're too confused about how to do this. It is a simple question. So one example here, we have the quote that we've picked out is, reach a point of utter exhaustion when, as a result of trench warfare, their nerves and brains would snap. That's the quote that we've picked out to think about the problems in treating people. The question that we're asking is, how well did soldiers recover from shell shock? We want to ask a question that isn't just a yes or no. We want to ask a question that tells us more about the treatment, about whatever the focus of that question is, which is treatments. What type of source I could use? In this case, we are using personal accounts from soldiers who have suffered from shell shock. And why? Why would we use that? Well, our rationale is because diaries and memoirs would help understand the impact that shell shock had on the sufferer after the war, and if the consequences were long term. And that's how you do that type of question. And once you finish that, be sure to submit your answer. Your teacher will be giving you a point based on the marks that you have given for that 4-marker. Collated, it'll be 4 marks. And we'll also be marking your Pip Quill paragraph based on 4 points, 4 marks, just to see if you are able to write a good Pip Quill paragraph. And then you are done. Make sure you press submit, and then you are finished. Thank you.